Hello, Endeavor here. So we're back with another classic movie stream, and I'm here as always with Morgoth. How you doing tonight, Morgoth?
I'm doing very well. We've got some absolutely beautiful weather here. And I've just had a bit of a drama with, I was telling you, that basically some jackdaws stole the meat that I was defrosting in the greenhouse for a barbecue. So we're going to have to make other plans. It's such a but what it is, the Barry gardener that I watch on YouTube, he's calling it magical May, and everything's coming alive and everything's all me hard work. Everything's starting to bulk up and grow quickly, and it's lovely. It's lovely. It's good for the soul. So I'm happy to get back out into it. But for now, we've got World War III and nuclear bombs.
Right. Well, we had the potential for them, and I chose this one because I kind of think it's pretty pertinent for what we're seeing today and the stuff we've seen going on in the world over the last couple of months. But overall, I mean, it is just a great movie in general. So today we're going to be talking about 13 Days. So it's a historical drama based on the Cuban Missile Crisis. So it takes place during the 13 days in October of 1962. It's focused on the American perspective on the conflict, and it basically goes over from the discovery of the nuclear weapons in Cuba to their removal 13 days later, or at least the agreement to their removal a couple of days, about 2 weeks later or so. Before we get into a breakdown of the plot, I will say that it is just this great drama movie, great historical drama, a lot of tension, very well made, and a very enjoyable film. So before I get into just a breakdown of the film, what are your early takes on it?
Well, I love this film. I'd seen it once before, a long time ago when it first came out, and this kind of genre of film is one of my favorites. Basically, it's angry men stuck in a room, like smoking cigarettes and drinking coffee and shouting at each other, trying to deal with an existential problem. And there's another one. There's a one where the about the banking collapse called Margin Call, which is great. What another one that's Glenn Ross is like that. And then there's more of them in the
Chernobyl.
70s as well. And so, what's that?
Chernobyl's like another good example.
Chernobyl's another one that fits into this. And I just Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy a little bit as well. And I just love it where you've got these people who like hate each other, and they're under severe amounts of stress. And you get to see the trying to solve the problem and all the things that go wrong. And I just find it fascinating. And I wish they'd make more things like that. But we'll get into it because the problem is it's quite intelligent. It's quite tightly scripted and clever.
All right, so I'll give a breakdown of the plot of the movie, which is basically just the Cuban Missile Crisis, the history. And now the movie has some slight differences. I know that I read that Kevin Costner's character wasn't actually as involved in the decision making as the film portrays him, but he's the protagonist. So the film is from his perspective, as he's like the man in the room that the crisis. It's through his eyes, pretty much. And the other thing is a few things here and there were just played up for dramatic effect. But for the most part, at least from what I've been told, from what I've read, the movie is a fairly accurate and a quite fair portrayal of the Cuban Missile Crisis. So I'll give a bit of a background on the history and as it relates to the plot of the film as well. So in 1959, this was middle of the Cold War. There was a revolution in Cuba. And once Fidel Castro took over Cuba, it became a Soviet-aligned state in the Western Hemisphere. So only a short distance away from the continental United States. So the Cold War prior to that, the boundary was Germany, all the way off in Europe. So that was on the Soviets' doorstep, but it was quite a ways away from the United States, who was the leader of the Western Bloc. But by Cuba falling under Soviet influence, what that did was it gave them an ally that was right on America's doorstep. And it was obviously a huge problem for the United States because that's a enemy aligned state that's right on their borders, or just a couple of hundred kilometers off their shores. So in 1961, there was the Bay of Pigs invasion. It was one of the first things that John F. Kennedy did when he was in office, when he was elected in 1960. It was an invasion of Cuba by Cuban exiles with American backing, but it failed to depose Castro, and it ended up being it ended up being an embarrassment for Kennedy, and he had to even he had to not commit American air forces because they wanted to just disavow the entire thing and claim that they had nothing to do with it. So in October 1962, what the Soviet Union had done is they had secretly snuck nuclear weapons into Cuba, and weapons which had the capability of striking almost the entire continental United States. I think the only place that they might not have been able to reach was like Seattle, but it would cover Washington, New York, pretty much the entire country. And these were spotted by American spy planes in October 1962. And well, this is how the Cuban Missile Crisis started, when Kennedy got news that these missiles had been spotted in Cuba. So it would have given the USSR a significant advantage in first strike capabilities. Now, it's worth noting that the United States had missiles in Turkey at the time, which were not far away from the Soviet Union, but putting the missiles in Cuba, that would have closed the distance. So you would have had the situation where they're moving closer and closer to each other, and trying to gain a first strike capability. So the decision was made by the Kennedy administration that they would not allow the missiles in Cuba. So the two, once the story broke and once Kennedy had to announce what was going on and people started to panic, the two options though there were several options, but the two main ones that were entertained were either blockading Cuba and preventing further weapons getting in and attempting to negotiate, or launching a full-scale invasion of Cuba and either invading Cuba or taking it out via airstrikes. And the trade-off is that neutralizing Cuba as a country would threaten to trigger a broader war with the Soviet Union, because there were Soviet troops in Cuba. They might move on West Berlin, that's NATO, and then the two blocks are at war with each other. The risk of the blockade strategy was that the missiles were still under development, so they risked those missiles becoming operational and the potential for them being used existing. So Kennedy opted for the blockade, which was termed quarantine, because the word blockade, because I think under international law, blockading a country is illegal if you haven't declared war. So they used the word quarantine to describe their operations. And they basically, the American Navy surrounded Cuba, prevented any ships from getting in. And there was a showdown that many Soviet ships approached the blockade. They were forced to turn back, but some didn't. There were actually some warning shots which were fired. Interesting story is that one of the Soviet subs, which had a nuclear warhead, the U.S. dropped depth charges to basically, they were warning charges. They were designed to get the sub to come to the surface, but the officers aboard didn't know that. And the captain and I think the political officer both voted to actually use the nuclear weapons because those were their orders. But there was an officer named Vasily Arkhipov who said that they shouldn't do it, and they needed his consent as well, and he didn't give his. And thankfully, they just narrowly avoided a nuclear weapon almost being used. So they really did come close to the brink on that one day towards the end of the crisis. I think it was a Saturday that they basically said that they needed plans to invade Cuba. I think it was on the Monday at the latest. So it was pretty close, but then a deal was struck. That the deal that they were able to strike was that the USSR would remove their missiles from Cuba with the guarantee that the United States would not attack Cuba. And then in a few months' time, the United States would remove the missiles which they had in Turkey in return. And yeah, that brought the end to the Cuban Missile Crisis. But it was it's considered by most to be the closest the Cold War ever came to becoming hot. And it's one of these things that we see these geopolitical crises today, but we don't really think of nuclear weapons actually being used. I mean, we can get into why that might be the case, but at the time, people thought this was a very real threat, and many people had the sense that their entire cities were going to be wiped off the map. That it was going to be just like, well, the end of life on Earth as we know it. So do you have any initial takes on either the Cuban Missile Crisis or the film's portrayal of it, Morgoth?
Well, I think the film is I think it's like a patriotic film done well. And there's a couple of things. You know what it reminded me of was the Mac. You remember when we did the McDonald's movie a few weeks ago, The Founder, and we were saying how like lovely America looked in that era, and I think you see it again here, but obviously from the perspective of the very top of the government rather than sort of the byways and the highways and the little takeaway restaurants and all of that kind of thing. But you still seem to have that lens here where it's nice and colourful and the sun shines and it comes across as wholesome. Like I think the actor, by the way, who portrays JFK in this is fantastic. I just look, he's called Bruce Greenwood, and for some reason we never really saw much of him after this, which I find strange because he's got lots of charisma. He's all of the little sort of ticks and the little knowing nods that he does is perfect. And I just think he really, I mean, both of the portrayal of the Kennedy brothers, yeah, I think is excellent. And you've got Kevin Costner as well, who again plays into this kind of wholesome American patriotic archetype. And when he did this, he was getting a little bit past his kind of pretty boy era. And he slotted into these roles as kind of bureaucrats and cops. But what's interesting is, of course, and I'm not going to dwell on this because I cannot be asked with all the conspiracy theories, but it is almost like a kind of spiritual prequel to JFK because uh, Kevin Costner's in that as well as Jim Garrison investigating the assassination. But you also get this thing where Kennedy was trying to do the right thing. The Kennedy brothers had kind of gone a little bit rogue against the American deep state. And then as well as all of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the military, being kind of infuriated by them. And there's a bit in this where Curtis LeMay is storming out. We can get into this a little bit more later, but he's storming out of the Oval Office, and he basically says like those two bastards are going to ruin this country unless we do something about it. And I just think it's an interesting sort of line to put in there because, well, I mean, whether or not he said that, I don't know. But the fact is, the people who made the film put it in, so they definitely want to lean into the Oliver Stone sort of depiction of the Kennedys as it's like the military is the ones who really were the ultimate enemies. Whereas today, and I mean, even more recently, it's getting more connected with Israel and all of that. But in this one, it leans into what I would say is the Hollywood sort of preferred version of it, which is to cast shade on the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the military. Take it or leave it. I mean, I don't really have any strong views on this one way or another. I'm more interested in sort of the law of films and how they tend to pick off each other and reflect each other across different films and different media interpretations of things.
So yeah, you mentioned that it takes place around the same time as the Founder. So the Founder takes place in the 1950s, early 60s, and this is around the same time period. So this is 1962, and yeah, you do get the sense that this is peak America. That it's before the Vietnam War and the Civil Rights Movement. I know that stuff was like started. That was stuff was picking up at this point, so it was just about to get into full swing. But it was just before that had. It was just before kind of that doubt kind of set in. And it was just after America had won the Second World War and they were the most powerful country in the world. And yeah, it does seem like it does definitely seem like a time of optimism for the United States. And you mentioned like in terms of like a patriotic movie. I mean, one thing that really stood out to me is that I know that Kennedy was a Democrat. I know that he was considered a liberal at the time, but you don't really get the sense of him being like hyper partisan. He kind of, he just kind of comes across as this figure who can be a representative of the entire country, which is just something you just couldn't possibly have in a country like America today, or really almost any Western country for that matter. But yeah, you get that. I mean, we might get into that a bit later because I do have a bit to say about that. But it does seem like it's like this era is peak America. So when they had reached their geopolitical zenith and the most powerful superpower in the world, And then this is also the era of the Cold War. So the USSR was the second most powerful country in the world at the time. However, they were a somewhat distant second. They weren't quite up there. But with the existence of nuclear weapons, however, both of the two superpowers had the capability of wiping the other one off the map. Now, my take on the Cold War era. Now, it's not necessarily the ideology or anything like that, because I'm a critic. I'm not a fan of liberal democracy or of communism, so I'm opposed to both of them. I think they're both terrible political systems. But then, so this was the divide during the Cold War, and I actually kind of have perhaps a bit of a controversial take on it. That I feel like that order might have been more stable than we realize, because nuclear weapons had just been invented after the end of World War II. By the 1960s, both the two powers had the capability of wiping each other off the face of the earth. Although that also came with mutually assured destruction, meaning that in doing so, they'd be destroying themselves. So it kind of created this mutual understanding that nobody wanted the Cold War to turn hot, if for nothing else, for self-preservation. However, both sides still had geopolitical interests of their own, and both of them wanted to expand those. So you saw proxy wars like the Korean War, Vietnam, the Soviet-Afghan War, stuff like that, and then backing the Cuban Revolution. However, the Cuban Missile Crisis it's considered to be the closest point that the two sides came to open military confrontation. And despite that ever-present threat of nuclear destruction, the order actually did seem quite stable, because at least like from my reading of it, it seemed like both sides kind of clearly had their own interests, and they were interested in expanding their spheres of influence, but they understood boundaries as well. That that's your territory. This is ours. We'll squabble over Cuba or Vietnam or Korea or something like that, but certain things are off limits. So we have Western Europe, you have Eastern Europe, and I think when you look at the preceding order that existed during the first half of the 20th century, which ended up with the two world wars, and then the stuff we see today, which had the war on terror, and now seems like interstate war is back on the menu with things like Russia, Ukraine, Israel, Iran, and so on. I have to think that was the Cold War geopolitical arrangement actually more stable than what came before and after it, even though that it had like the most anxiety about just total destruction. Now, that's not a commentary on the ideology of the two sides of the Cold War, but I think as a setup, it might have actually been pretty stable. What are your takes on that?
Yeah, I think so. The danger is what's a big part of this, of the narrative of the film, is trying to assess whether the other side is a rational actor or a good faith actor. So the Joint Chiefs, and especially Curtis LeMay, who actually was like one of the most hawkish people ever. I mean, it's important to remember all of these men had been through wars, like quite a few. They did quite a few battles and quite a few sort of unpleasantness by the time they're in their middle age and into this era. And one of the ways that I was thinking about it was that if you then take the it's game theory basically, where you've got that prisoner's dilemma thing, and it's like, will my accomplice actually betray me, or will he see the mutual benefits of staying loyal? And it's the same thing here. And the way to look at it, the way I was thinking about it, was that the Kennedy brothers come across as dovish, because when it comes down to it, they see Khrushchev as a rational actor, as acting in good faith, whereas the Joint Chiefs are automatically on the assumption that basically the Soviet Union is a bad actor because they're communists and they are enemies. I would even go further when it gets to somebody like Curtis LeMay, where he would be of the view that it didn't even matter if they were good faith or bad faith. The fact is, they were a threat to America and they should be bombed to hell and back, and we should kind of get on with it. And I mean, there's a lot to all of this. This is really the beating heart of the film, and that's why it's so interesting to watch and so intelligent. But when you apply that to the Cold War, like as it was, the problem is you can reach an equilibrium, but the danger then comes with proxies. So, like almost all of the Cold War was fought through proxies. In this case, it was Cuba. But what's part of the story in the background is that America has missiles in Turkey. And then you also get the problem with Berlin at the time. But then, right at the start of the film, Kennedy is reading, like he says out loud, he's reading a newspaper, and he says to Kevin Costner that basically this situation with Vietnam's getting worse and worse, and it's not, I don't think it's ever mentioned again, but it's kind of sprinkled in there that it's what's the destabilizing element in the Cold War is actually the proxies. It is actually your satellites and your allies out, which could actually drag you into a confrontation and create a flashpoint, which is exactly what happened with the Cuban Missile Crisis. And then earlier, which Curtis LeMay was also involved with, was the Berlin airlift and all of this kind of thing. So time and time again, where you actually go eyeball to eyeball with your main adversary is because something has gone wrong with a proxy. But it did seem that they had kind of reined this in. By the time you get into the 1980s, you've got it again with Afghanistan. But it seems to, I think it was more or less stable. But you could say, well, it would be better if we were all just sort of liberal capitalists and eating McDonald's, and if that just, then you would remove the threat entirely. But that's a whole other subject.
Yeah, so there's the issue of, like, because it gets into the issue of like the military leaders versus the civilian leaders. So you see with Curtis LeMay, like he actually had a reputation from the Second World War as well, that they called him bombs away LeMay. So some people thought that he was way too brutal on his bombing campaigns in Japan, for example. So he had a reputation of being one of the most hawkish generals that they had in the United States in the era. I mean, I guess with one thing, the other thing is that I'm sure that the Soviet Union, they had plenty of guys who would have been quite the same. So there would have been generals who were just chomping at the bit to go to war. I guess the big problem you have in the Cold War is that, like for example, when there was that showdown in Berlin when their two sides were approaching each other, if one of those guys fires his rifle, well, then does a firefight ensue, and then do the countries end up going to war over that? I mean, that's what almost happened with the blockade. So, like I mentioned during the breakdown, one of the Soviet subs almost actually thought that they were being fired upon and were about to actually detonate a nuclear warhead. So, I mean, it was a lot closer to getting a lot worse than people realized at the time. I think it took people quite a while to actually realize how bad the Cuban Missile Crisis actually was. People certainly would have been panicking at the time. But yeah, you mentioned the proxies. So someone like Fidel Castro, he seemed to be a lot more rabid than someone like Khrushchev. So are they rational actors? I mean, from my knowledge I know Khrushchev, he had a few like crazy outbursts at times, but in terms of the Cuban Missile Crisis, I get the sense that Kennedy and Khrushchev were both thinking about it rationally, but then I don't think someone like Fidel Castro was nearly as rational, and that could end up being leading to disaster, because they could do something that sparks a response. Like for example, there was that plane that was shot down. So into the crisis, there was an American spy plane which was flying over Cuba. Which what that was to do was to find sites to target in an airstrike. So where would the United States strike in Cuba to take out the missiles? And the plane was shot down by the air defense in Cuba. They don't know exactly whether it was a rogue officer who shot it down or whether it was orders that came from up high. But I mean, that's one of those situations where you now have to. I mean, that was grounds for them going to war. So there's a scene in the movie which I know it wasn't actually entirely accurate, but I like the fact that they put it in. So Kevin Costner's character says to some of the pilots who were going to do this reconnaissance flight over Cuba, the ones that actually came back alive, And he says to them, like, you're not to be shot at. And it's like, oh, yeah, we're going to, of course not. But what he says is that even if you get shot at, say that it was a bird, say that you crashed, say that it was anything other than the enemy firing at you, because then when the generals who get word that they have been fired on, they're going to say, well, that this is our rules of engagement are that we have to go to war now. And the Kennedy administration didn't want to have to commit to that. So like one of their planes actually was shot down, and not actually committing to going to war. Because based on the rules of engagement, you actually have the right to do it at that time. So it's really difficult. It's just like a really difficult situation to navigate, and you have to just imagine the stress that that it just must have put these guys under at the time. It would have just been immense.
Yeah, I mean, again, like to sort of take the side of the generals in this, their perspective would be that, well, if we allow the Soviets to shoot down an airplane and they don't get a response from us, they're going to do it again, and then they're going to do it again. And one of the chiefs says, basically, the Soviet only understands force and power, and that's what we're going to have to show. There's an interesting sort of byline to all of this, where what's going on in the background is that they don't seem to be as interested in what's going on in the United Nations. And there's the Russian delegate at the United Nations is kind of slagging America off. He's kind of just giving them a hard time. And then they send in Adlai Stevenson, and they think he's a bit weak. They think he is the one that proposes the off ramp at the start, which seems like way too much of a concession. But then he goes in and he kind of nails there's the first thing that happens is that the Americans begin to realize how useful the United Nations is, because the Russians are beginning to win in the court of public opinion. Like they are beginning to frame the Americans as being the aggressors in the crisis. And what's interesting is that Stevenson goes in and he makes the Russian admit or concede that there are no nuclear missiles on Cuba, which we as the viewer know is a blatant lie. So then he pulls out the photographs and the evidence and the proof and wins the day. And so all of a sudden, there's a couple of things revealed there. One of them is that it's all very well, again, so if you look at it from the perspective of the chiefs, you'd think that's a victory for them, because Russia has then been revealed to be dishonest. They haven't just admitted that, yeah, we actually did place some nukes on Cuba, 90 miles off the coast of Florida. And then they even sort of amped them up a bit so that the only place they couldn't reach in America was the city of Seattle. Everything else could be hit because they put extra long range ones in there as well. And so it's kind of strange, because we are obviously more sympathetic to the Kennedys in this in the narrative, but it is the case that the Russians have lied. It is the case that the Russians have deceived them on this, and they needed them sort of expose the lie in front of everybody. And another thing is, I mean, I don't want to sort of jump ship to current day affairs, but you do see the usefulness of the United Nations as an institution for this kind of thing. These days, everybody hates it because it's globalist and it's all this. But the fact is that the sidelining of the United Nations by, say, America these days could really come back to get them, because I've noticed that countries like Russia and China take the United Nations a lot more seriously than what especially the Trump administration does. And what that does is give them a platform and a pulpit to be the honest brokers, to say we are abiding by international law, and we are willing to lay our cards on the table here, that United Nations. We are not sort of trying to destroy the institution as a rogue state would. So I think that, and you see here that the penny drops for the Kennedys and the Americans. Like, actually, we could use this, especially because we're in the right, especially because we've got the evidence. Why are we allowing these people to badmouth us and be so blatantly dishonest when we've got the evidence? And so that's how it plays out. But it's not that important for the main narrative, but it's just interesting the way the public opinion shifts there, and it does actually in a little kind of way prove that the military are correct about the Russians.
Yeah, I mean to give them their due, because the movie is, of course, from the perspective of about 40 years later, and of course we now know with hindsight that the correct decision was the decision which Kennedy ultimately made. However, you also have to remember that they didn't know what was going to happen at the time. So from the military's perspective, you have to remember that these missiles in Cuba, they're trying to get them operational, and they really only have a limited amount of time when they could make a strike without those missiles actually being fired. Because another thing that they mention in the some of these scenes where they're having these debates between the generals and the politicians, one thing that they mention is that, well, if we do this limited airstrike, well, we might get 95% of the weaponry that they have in Cuba, but that 5% that we don't get, well, then that's just gonna cause absolute devastation. That could take out a city. So they're in this position where if they don't act right away, well, then those missiles will become operational and then can be used. So there is the argument for just going in right away and not even giving the Soviets enough time to make those missiles operational and just taking them out right away. But then you run the risk of, well, the other end of the equation, that being then the Soviet Union moves on Berlin, and then all these treaties and things like NATO and the Warsaw Pact come into play, and then you're in a situation of war. So yeah, I mean, of course, we now know that the right decision was the less escalatory one, the one that Adlai Stevenson brought up in the film, and the one that Kennedy ended up actually going with. But you have to just understand that in that kind of situation, you wouldn't have known that. You wouldn't have had the hindsight to see what would end up happening, because you have to kind of just predict. So much of the movie, it doesn't show the movie from the Soviet perspective. So you don't actually see Khrushchev in the movie. There aren't any scenes inside the Kremlin of the Soviet leaders arguing back and forth. It would have been pretty interesting. But who knows? Maybe they can make a separate movie about that. Sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say one of the great bits in the film is that they get like a kind of what do you call that thing they're using, like a telegram from Khrushchev, and they get their specialists to analyze it and the language that's being used and how it's being expressed in this way, and they say that this is coming from somebody who's under extreme stress. And what you begin to realize is that actually the people that we are watching, which is the American government, basically, they're all totally stressed out and terrified and having and like kissing their families goodbye and all of this kind of thing, like sort of little weepy sort of goodbyes as with Kevin Costner as his son's playing football, and all of this, getting prepared to go under the mountain and all of this, knowing that their family will not be allowed to join them. But then in that little sort of throwaway section of it, you realize, it dawns on you that the Russians are also terrified. This is also happening in Moscow. Like you say, we didn't see it. But then it kind of changes the whole dynamic of the film, because if you want to have the sort of the bad faith actor interpretation of the Khrushchev, which is kind of mainly what the Joint Chiefs have got, then you would think that they are actually sort of moving the pieces on the chessboard, having an evil laugh, or they're just crazy. But in actual fact, it's precisely because they are also rational actors that they're having a meltdown themselves over where this is going. And so what you begin to realize is that all of these highly super competent rational men are trapped. They're stuck in the circumstances and the policies and the strategies they've developed. They've become entangled. Nobody wants a nuclear war, but they're hurtling towards it because of what the situation that they find themselves trapped in. So then you think This is crazy. Is this how history works? Where and it's, I think this is, I mean, we didn't mention Robert McNamara in here, who's this kind of, he's great. I watched some interviews with him just before when I was potting around in the garden. I've always found him to be a fascinating character. And this is kind of what he says. Like, you end up stuck and you're trapped, and you don't want to do things that you're forced to do. And he was referring to Lemire, who was firebombing the Japanese cities in World War II and all of this kind of thing. And it's the way that you can end up. I mean, McNamara was certainly a kind of rationalist, but you still end up in these irrational situations. You still end up like burning the world to a cinder and wiping out humanity is an irrational act, but you haven't actually taken any irrational steps along the way to get there. And it's this real kind of philosophical conundrum. And luckily, I mean, we didn't mention it, but luckily all of these men who have to deal with it are supremely competent. I think that some of the Joint Chiefs are a little bit bullish, but they whatever you make of them, they are extremely high IQ. I mean, they're not there because they tick the box, you know?
Well, actually, I wanted to say a few words on John F. Kennedy himself as a figure. I mean, the way he's portrayed in the movie, I think is excellent. I mean, the guy doesn't exactly nail JFK's accent, but otherwise, like as an actor, he does do a phenomenal job. One thing that I it really stands out to me with the character like John F. Kennedy and as a figure is that, like, ideologically, I think there are a lot of negative things to say about someone like John F. Kennedy. So he helped put into motion a lot of the worst policies, which had the most negative impacts on the United States long term. So I know that he died before a lot of these were actually passed, but Lyndon Johnson, who was his vice president and then became the president after Kennedy was assassinated and later was reelected. He was the one who passed the Civil Rights Act, the Hart-Celler Act. So this was the legislation which basically made American law inherently anti-white and then opened the door to mass non-white immigration. So, and John F. Kennedy was kind of seen as an icon of post-war liberalism, which unfortunately is it's the consensus which we're living under now, and which is causing us all the problems that our countries are now facing. Having said that, I can understand why someone like John F. Kennedy really became the inspirational icon that he did, because not saying anything about like the guy's worldview in particular. I mean, he just seems like a far more competent and intelligent leader than anyone that you've seen in the United States or really the West anywhere over the last 30 or 40 years. So the United States was, I mean, it was that peak America era that we mentioned. So, you know, just after World War II, where every guy has the house in the suburbs, the white picket fence, the car, and the 2-3 kids. So it would have been definitely a great time to be an American. And one thing is you get the sense with John F. Kennedy is that he's read history, literature, the classics. You get the sense that that his ideas are informed by this, whereas you get the sense that someone like Donald Trump has never read a book in his entire life, and I get the impression from someone like Joe Biden or Barack Obama that the only things they've read are like Michel Foucault and Robin DiAngelo and just other libtard crap from the present day. So, I mean, I had a take on it a bit, which I can get into a bit later. But John F. Kennedy references The Guns of August, so it's a book about the beginning of the First World War, and I think that they reference this in the movie. That he says he had some kind of line like, "We don't want this to become the missiles of October." So when we see when you see the disaster that is the post-war consensus today, I mean, part of that does you have to lay some of that blame at figures like John F. Kennedy. I think Lyndon Johnson was a lot worse, but I mean they were both in the same administration. So if Kennedy had lived, then who knows what he would have actually. He probably would have gone along with the same stuff, but. He's someone that can actually sell post-war liberalism to you in a way that a lot of people can get behind it. And I guess when you look at it, it's not that surprising that people did get behind a figure like John F. Kennedy, because, I mean, call me a boomer, but it seems like he handled the Cuban Missile Crisis perfectly. I mean, I can't really think of anything that during that crisis that he really should have done that he didn't do. It seems like he was. I mean, I get the impression that a full-scale nuclear war was a real possibility, and the decisions he made really helped avert that. So I think maybe the admiration that someone might have for John F. Kennedy, it's more of a product of him being of a healthier and more stable society, not necessarily the political ideology which he would pioneer. But yeah, I do think that he genuinely was a very good statesman, perhaps with the wrong worldview, but definitely a good man.
The book that he cites as well, and he kind of talks about it, is again in World War One, where according to what he cites in the film, that once again you had all of these great powers who didn't actually want to go to war, and they were all run by competent, good men, but they still found themselves locked in a trajectory that dragged them into a bloodbath. And so you get this sense that somebody like Kennedy is aware of himself in history, and the same for his brother. I would say the same for most of these people, actually, where they're aware that what they are going through is a historical time, and then they look back on previous eras, and they can say they've got the reading and they've got the understanding to say this is how World War One happened, and we are in it now. And then he mentions about how that would play out, what you got into earlier, where we bomb their airfields, so they go for Berlin, so then we go for Moscow, and then they come back at us with nukes, so we let our nukes fly, and that's how it'll go. And again, you're stuck, you're trapped in that kind of weird equilibrium where everybody could die, or you just kind of find a way around it through diplomacy and through letting your opponent know that you're a good faith actor, which is something that McNamara gets into, where he starts to scream at like a Navy captain, because they're trying to give, through the movements and the maneuvers of the fleet, they're trying to signal to Khrushchev that they are holding back, that they want an off-ramp here. And then it's like, will he pick up on those signals? Will he pick up on those little signs? And it appears to be that he does, because of the sort of the backroom wheeling and dealing that goes on, which ends up winding the thing down.
So there was the scene where I think it was a cruiser or one of the U.S. Navy ships fires off warning flares at a Soviet ship approaching the blockade, and then McNamara freaks out and screams at the admiral, and saying that he didn't realize that they were warning flares, and what if the enemy makes the same mistake, and that no one is to fire unless they have direct orders from the president. So I know that that might not entirely be accurate. I think that the ships had their own orders, and they didn't need direct confirmation from Kennedy to actually take action. But there's an interesting line that McNamara has in the film, that he says that this is a new vocabulary. It's President Kennedy communicating with Premier Khrushchev, and that this is how diplomacy is done in this new Cold War era. Which is very interesting, because you have to do it through things like these letters. Like when they got the two letters, they had to decide, well, are these even from Khrushchev? Are they fake? Are they a diversion? Are they written to waste time so that they have time to continue to construct the equipment? So you get the sense that nobody knew nobody knew exactly what was going on, but with the other side. I mean, I know the movie doesn't really show the Soviet perspective, but in some ways it actually makes the film a bit more powerful, because you don't know. So you don't know. I mean, we know with hindsight, but I mean, from in the perspective of the movie, you don't actually know what's going on. So there is even a part where they said that Khrushchev has been deposed. He's no longer in power. We're now dealing with a hardline Soviet government. Now we know that that was incorrect. He was deposed, but that was 2 years later. But anyway, but they wouldn't have known that at the time. So what was actually done, I believe, after the Cuban Missile Crisis, was they had this hotline which was installed from the White House to the Kremlin, so that in the case of any kind of incident like this in the future, they'd have a direct line where they could talk to each other immediately without having to wait for letters to be translated and to be decrypted and everything like that. So like a few things that actually the Soviets had done during the Cuban Missile Crisis was they actually just broadcast a lot of Khrushchev's responses over Radio Moscow. So there's this story that I forget who the guy was, but one of the guys who had written up a response had to drive down, like he had to speed down to the radio station in Moscow, breaking all the traffic rules, busted into the room and told the guy, "You don't have time to prepare for this. You just have to deliver this speech right away, reading it as you go, because we have to give out this response." Because they were worried that if it were an hour or two later, well then it could end in disaster. So I mean, it is kind of thankful that later on in the Cold War they had this like kind of a direct line, and the same things didn't happen. But you would have just had to imagine at the time, how do you interpret all these different messages? So someone fires something, how do you interpret that?
I remember there was a kind of an anecdote that used to go around. I don't know if it's true or not, but there was supposed to have been like a flock of geese flying towards Moscow, and they put everything on like a red alert or whatever. They went to DEFCON 2 because the Americans hadn't told them that the hotline didn't go, and here on their radar systems that was picking up that there was all kinds of activity moving towards them. I find that fascinating, and what you actually have, which is in the film, is where the famous episode where they shot the U-2 down, the spy plane down. And when you look into that a little bit, it's crazy how like the seat of the pants it was, because they didn't actually have contact with the pilot because the Soviets would be able to pick up that contact. So he didn't have a radar either. And then on top of that, because he was flying so close to the Arctic, the magnetics messed up all of the navigation gadgets. So he actually had to use the stars. Like he actually had to use this 17th century technology in this state-of-the-art plane to figure out whereabouts he was and where he was going. And the problem, again, you run into is that if he is detected and he stumbles into Russian airspace, then they don't know if he's coming loaded with nuclear bombs. They don't know that he's actually just taking a few photos, or that the navigation's been scrambled and he's kind of mistakenly gone over into Russian airspace. So then they send up MiGs to find out what's going on, and then the Americans see what's happening. So then you can see how this is like it's insane. Like this is why it was mad. It was so fitting, because how close you could come. I mean, no, these days people say there's no such thing as nuclear weapons. It was all theater and everything. I think that's just nonsense. I don't believe any of that. I think we genuinely came close to an abyss here, time and time again. And one of the U-2 planes was actually shot down, which is another funny thing, which kind of brings us a little bit sort of to modern day politics in a way, is that you in the Cold War, like they were a lot more gung ho. They would just shoot you down. They were just talking about just annihilating Cuba in this and then going for a full on invasion, knowing that they would have lost like thousands upon thousands of American soldiers. It was much more of a Curtis LeMay mentality. He seems crazy from today's perspective, but all of them, I would say, were more willing to let people die than what we are now with something like that clown show in the Middle East.
Well, yeah, they would have just been out of World War II, so a lot of them would have been alive to see wars like that. So wouldn't have been anything out of the ordinary. Because even think of something like the Korean War. Tens of thousands of American troops died in the Korean War. Quite a few number of Canadians and Brits also fought and died in the Korean War. So they were a lot more willing to send people off to fight. I think Vietnam. I think it was about 50,000 American soldiers died in Vietnam, which is quite a large amount.
It was McNamara that went on to sort of design the air campaign over Vietnam, where it was just how many square miles of jungle have you burned to the ground today type deal. It was, and then working everything out via a spreadsheet where you kind of like, well, the average sort of square mile in Vietnam has got these many people in, and out of these many people, there will be maybe 2 enemy soldiers. So if we destroy 100 square miles of jungle, we can say that maybe we killed 400 soldiers that day. Like this was the logic of it all. It's and the famous one about we had to destroy the building, the village to save the building, save the village was a McNamara line as well. And yet you listen to him in an interview, and he's a supremely intelligent, well-read man. It's not like they were just some goon squad. But this sort of, I mean, what I was going to say as well, this kind of, when you look at the people from this era, McNamara being a standout, they do have this kind of very dry and bureaucratic way of talking about the military. So like the blood and the guts are abstracted away as far as possible from reality. But I think in McNamara's case, he was genuinely just like that. He genuinely was looking at this in terms of just raw sort of rationalism, numbers, spreadsheets, because that was the sort of the managerial way of doing it. And what I find interesting today is that if you look at somebody like Pete Hegseth, and I've wrote this before, it's as if he tries to do that. So he'll come out, he'll use this language, but like more hyper real and more pompous and more ridiculous. And it's so in McNamara's case, he's using the language just because that's his job, because he's dealing with data and numbers and this strategies and tactics and things. And with Pete Hegseth, you get the impression that he doesn't really think like that, and he's not smart enough to do what McNamara did. But what instead he's trying to do is sound like the men who you see on these films. He's trying to sound like people in Jason Bourne thrillers, where it's all this talk about the optimum mobility and of assets in situ. All of this, it's just all jargon, but it isn't jargon that he's come to sort of naturally. It's that he's trying to sound like somebody like Robert McNamara in a movie that he saw, or a CIA kind of capo in a Mission Impossible film, or sitting in front of lots of computer screens and all of this. And it kind of sums up why the latest thing has been such a mess in with Iran. And I was thinking on this subject, like what would have been their response to what's been happening, say, with the Strait of Hormuz, and I mean, Curtis LeMay would have just bombed Iran with dumb bombs, just dropped, because you can produce them in massive numbers, and they would just fly everything they had over and just rain hellfire down on the Iranians until they gave in. And the losses that the Americans would take, they would eat them. They would just eat those losses and take them and carry it on. Whereas what you see now is this kind of squirmishness, and look, maybe rightly so, that you don't want to see 10,000 casualties. You don't want to see endless body bags coming home, But then if you're not, then that means don't go to war in the first place with a big country.
Yeah, it's interesting because it's true that wars in the 20th century had a lot higher kill count. Although, in fact, I mean, if you look at something like Russia, Ukraine, or the Israel-Gaza war, that's actually getting up there now. But I mean, let's just say if we're going like the era that preceded this one. So like I say 2010s and 2000s. Yeah, the death count was a lot lower. So something like Iraq, which is still a lot when you think of it. About seven, I think it was like 7 or 8,000 U.S. soldiers died. Which I mean, in today's in hindsight, it seems like it was for nothing. But that's not really nearly as much as died in something like Vietnam. But even though the kill count might seem higher, I also get the sense that, and you mentioned this with someone like Pete Hegseth, but I think it's that more broadly there is just this lack of competence, but also this kind of disconnect from reality that you see among the political class these days. So I think that a lot of this, one thing you'll see whenever there's this geopolitical situation, whether it's with Saddam Hussein or Putin, or whether it's Iran now or whatever it may be, they always try to make said person out to be Hitler, and everything is always Munich, and it's always appeasement, and they're going to be the new whatever Third Reich or anything. It's kind of this cartoonish like good versus evil. My enemy is this comic book villain. I feel that this isn't actually so much a product of World War II as it is the way that World War II has been established as a foundational myth. I think that's the real culprit behind the problem, because John F. Kennedy and Nikita Khrushchev both fought in World War II. However, they both saw each other as legitimate leaders of powerful countries with legitimate geopolitical interests, and they had mutual respect for each other as leaders. So Khrushchev saw Kennedy as the president of the U.S., and Kennedy saw Khrushchev as the premier of the USSR, and they didn't see each other as like this evil boogeyman who's going to dominate the world or something like that. And I mentioned that John F. Kennedy read the book "The Guns of August," and that helped influence him in the Cuban Missile Crisis. I get the sense these days that leaders of Western countries, that their influence is something like Schindler's List, or some kind of some kind of other Hollywood propaganda movie that just kind of makes the enemy out to be this kind of cartoonishly evil bad guy. And they also don't seem to have the same kind of understanding of being a representative of a nation. So one thing that you see in the film 13 Days is that there's a scene of Kevin Costner's son. He's playing football. It's really wholesome at the beginning, where his kid wakes him up and is kind of a pain in the ass in the morning. And you get the sense that like it's this nice country that and it's our job to defend it. And what you hear today is it's always our democracy, our values. It's always these vague universalist egalitarian values, which of the post-war era, but which really just allow our leaders to feel like they're self-righteous people, and that seems to be what's motivating them, not like the sense that they actually are representatives of a country. And their point of reference seems to just be like this kind of pop culture, which makes every conflict out to be this kind of cartoonish comic book, everyone is Hitler kind of narrative. And I think that's a culprit for many of the problems that we have today.
Yeah, that's how I see the Trump administration. I see it as being entirely a creation of media. And I don't mean it in the sense that which it's part of it, where they sort of spin narratives and lie and bullshit. But I mean the actual people themselves. When Trump came out, like 4 days into the Iran war, whatever, and he demanded unconditional surrender. Like that's a kind of I remember all like the geopolitical analysts. They were all tearing their hair out because they were saying like he's such a moron. He doesn't know what that means, because what that signal, if you say unconditional surrender, what that signals to a regime and the population is that you have to be completely prostrate before your enemy, like helpless, so that all of your institutions, all of your military, all of your police, everything will be handed over. So what that does is create an incentive in that population to sort of dig in and fight to the very, very end of their tether, which is what the Germans did when that was. And here's the thing, like Donald Trump has picked up that line because he knows that it sounds something which is a bit cool. He's watched a series or a film about World War II, and that he's heard that line and thought that it sounds tough and bombastic and threatening, and he's rolled it out for that reason without thinking about it. But and firstly, they didn't have the capability to make Iran surrender or surrender whatsoever, as it turns out. But then, secondly, it's because he didn't even understand what he was doing because he was living within a Hollywood film, and this is what a lot of the sort of opponents, the Iranians, have been telling the Americans. They're living in a TV show. They're living in a movie. This is not reality. You're not talking like rational politicians with a sound tactic and sound strategies that you actually have a goal that you're trying to achieve. You're acting roles as if you're in Hollywood productions, which is so much about what's been gone on here. Like when that weird business, when they rescued the pilot that went down, and there was all kinds of airplanes went missing, and there was a lot of like theories and questions, and you never saw them again. They never paraded them on television or anything. But that's literally the wag the dog sort of line that we covered now. Wag the dog, sort of looking at the Ukraine war some years ago. But here you see that they've done that exact script for this. The pilot goes down, and we got him. We got old Shoe back. And this, what's crazy about this is that in the real world, like the oil has actually been, reduced by 20%. Like there is now much less fertilizers on the market for farmers. That's a real thing in the real world. Yet somehow the fake narrative, market manipulation, abstractions can just get punted along. and you'll see a bit of inflation here or there, but thus far it just doesn't seem to matter. And it's amazed me since this whole thing is kicked off, where you think finally there is actually a there. Finally, we're going to get to the desert of the real. We're going to touch hard granite here. And so far, it's just still bullshit and people pretending to be characters that they've seen on a Hollywood film, complete with the dialogue and everything. This is mental.
Well, you even see like what they're releasing these promo videos with clips from Yu-Gi-Oh and Call of Duty. Like, so they're putting out these videos of like airstrikes in Iran over like music compilations of Gladiator and and this pop culture from this era. And it just seems like this is the lens through which geopolitics is being done by the Trump administration. I won't say it's just them because there are other examples as well. But like they're putting out these promo videos. Like, so we're going to war in Iran. Here's this clip from some I don't know, Robin Hood, Russell Crowe as Robin Hood launching a bow and arrow. Isn't it badass? Yeah, I mean, it just goes to show that when you contrast that with the seriousness that people like Robert McNamara or John F. Kennedy approached the Cuban Missile Crisis, the difference is just, it's unbelievable. Now, I will say that the Trump administration, they're certainly guilty of this, but you see this as well across the board today. So, for example, with the Ukraine war, they had this post where they were saying that Ukraine is the Rebel of Alliance, they're Harry Potter against Voldemort, or they're just some other like pop culture references. They're the Marvel superheroes. But you get this, you get the same, I get the same sense from the Russian side though, because someone like Vladimir Putin, he seems to want so badly to relitigate the Cold War. He wants to kind of like LARP as Joseph Stalin, and he wants to, he's still butthurt over losing the Cold War, and he wants to relitigate that and kind of recapture the glory days of the USSR when he would have been a little kid, but when they had just won the Second World War in this era, when they were on top, when they were the second superpower in the world. And then, you see that was the same from Israel as well. Everyone knows the narrative which they go with, but again, they're rolling out the same narrative of World War II, us being victims, and we're going to stop the same, and we're going to stop. It's never again is now. That's like the line that they bring up, which makes no sense. And I just get the sense that there's just this total lack of seriousness. And I think it's not just baby boomers who are doing it, but I think it has to be seen as an indictment on the boomer generation, just how they don't really seem to understand the gravity of the amount of power which they actually have.
I mean, you can make a direct comparison to the film that we're talking about and current day events, because it had been known for 20 years that if Iran gets properly attacked, rather than an assassination here or there, or a sort of weekend bombing, that if they do go all in on it, which, with their campaign, because they'll not put boots on the ground, but it was acknowledged and understood that they would take out the American bases in the area, and they would shut the Strait of Hormuz, and then they would knuckle down in their fortress nation until America began to suffer economic hardships and the world put pressure on them because there was no oil coming through and all the rest of it. So they did it anyway. The Trump regime did it anyway, and then acted kind of surprised that this had happened. So they did not consider anything beyond first order consequences, nothing. Whereas in the 13 days, as we already discussed, Kennedy can lay out, well, if we carpet bomb those bases in Cuba, they are then going to hit Berlin, which means we are then going to hit them back, and then they are going to eventually hit us back with nukes, and then we will have to trigger nukes. So he's looking at the most likely scenario and how it would play out. And then on top of that, his sort of advisors and analysts would say, well, this maybe if you go to like order 3 here, they may stop with Berlin. Can we sacrifice Berlin? Is it worth sacrificing Berlin to get nukes off Cuba? And so everything, the planning about what could potentially happen and what was likely to happen. Another one was where Kennedy had a back and forth about this with Curtis LeMay, and he said, "So what will they do if we do this? If we flatten Cuba and even invade Cuba, what will be their response?" And LeMay says they won't have a response; they'll do nothing. And Kennedy says nothing, and he says no. He says because they can't, because they, meaning the Soviets, they have also mapped out all of these different consequences and the road to, they know that it would be the road towards nuclear war. The dominoes would go down, you'd get a cascading effect. And so they, knowing what we know, wouldn't do it. They would just let Cuba go. Now, whether or not he was right about that, I don't know. But Kennedy replies by saying, well, if we blow up those bases, we're going to be killing Soviet soldiers. They're not going to do nothing. They're going to do something. So we need to understand what that something is. And you see again and again just the amount of the difference in IQ when you go back to what's going on in the Middle East now, where despite their own advisors telling them they will bomb our bases because they've got missiles, the mountains are full of missiles, and then they will close the Straits of Hormuz and they'll slowly strangle the world economy. We'll be hit with inflation and all the rest of it. For some reason, that wasn't even past number 1. They didn't get that far.
I was told that this would happen in university. So in university, I went to business school. I took a course on business in the Middle East, and the professor was a former Canadian ambassador. And he even said that if the United States attacked Iran, then Iran would block the Strait of Hormuz. Yeah, so I was told this back in around like 2014, 2015. as a university student. I've known this for over a decade, and I'm not particularly knowledgeable on the geopolitics of the Middle East. But the fact that that was just not even taken into consideration, well, maybe it was taken into consideration. And here's the other point. Now, look, I know that in the United States, Jewish power had been on the rise since they had arrived in the U.S. in the late 19th, early 20th century. I know it was starting to take off with Hollywood, and the 1960s was when it really started to pick up. However, when you look at something like the Cuban Missile Crisis, you at least get the sense that someone like John F. Kennedy is doing the decisions he is making are within the best interest of the United States. Now, I know that many of the policies, and many of the domestic policies which he endorsed and which his successors would later implement, were certainly not in the interest of the country. But you get this, you don't get the sense that he's like subservient to a foreign power to quite the extent that you get with the Trump administration, where with them it's entirely for Israel. I mean, what is the actual benefit for America? Where does America benefit from this war in Iran? They don't, because with the Cuban Missile Crisis, there were missiles pointed right at the American at the continental United States, capable of taking out almost any city on the entire continent. With the Iran, what was the threat? I mean, did they even come up with a narrative? Like, was it a recycle of the WMDs in Iraq? Was it that we needed to liberate the Iranian women and gays from Islamic law? I don't even know what the narrative was supposed to be. It seems like they just came out with one like post hoc and just like, oh, well, we did it. Okay, so what are we going to say? At WMDs, let's just go with that one. They didn't even try to justify it, and just the conflict of interest as well is just, it's glaring when you contrast the two.
And especially on the long term, I mean, it seems like every day they're hashing out this deal or that deal, and the consequences for America standing in the world. Like, are they? What'll it be? What happens if America has to pay reparations to Iran? What does that mean? It's just a total, and you still get MAGA influencers coping that this is some kind of grand. There is no plan. Netanyahu had a plan, but even that's not coming to fruition. It's just a mess because they're all morons. And I know that's not like, I know everybody wants to have some kind of what's that channel called? Promethean.
Promethean updates, where it's like, oh yeah, this disaster that Trump caused, oh, it's actually a stroke of genius. You see, he really got the city of London there.
We really own the city of London. We really got one over. We tanked the world economy and destroyed America's stand in the Middle East. But we're currently, it looks like we're about to leave like the Israelis hanging in the breeze here, which is going to be interesting to see unfold. But at least we own Lloyd's of London. Like, it's preposterous. It's like, to say that, they're all, I mean, I did a blog post on Substack a week after it happened, and I called it the retard war, and I stand by every word that I wrote, complete with Pete Hegseth doing a stupid impression of a CIA agent in a Bourne movie. It's just preposterous. And this is what happens when you get morons running your country, corrupt morons at that. They're smart enough to swindle the stock markets with all of this sort of strategically timed tweets. But it's just a circus. And the idea that MAGA influencers are going to say, oh, well, I live under Sharia law and I'm just butthurt because like the UK doesn't have an empire or whatever. Yeah, say whatever you want. But the fact is, it's a mess. There was no plan.
And the other thing to point out, which kind of struck me with the film 13 Days, and even like the figure of John F. Kennedy, I mentioned earlier that he seems to be possibly the last president to actually be admired as just a statesman in and of himself. That he wasn't like that he could be a representative of the entire American nation. Whereas you think of someone like Ronald Reagan, I mean, he might be an icon of the right in the United States, but the left hate him. And someone like Barack Obama might be an icon of the left, but then the right hate him. So, I mean, one thing that's telling is just how politicized. I mean, it's not just America these days, because I can't really think of any figure in any Western country that could be this apolitical, or maybe not apolitical, but non-partisan figurehead who would be admired by the nation as a whole, rather than just the respective side of the political spectrum which they're on. You have to imagine that if something happened like this today, or you can even apply it to things that have happened, there are all these conspiracy theories that go on. There's all this second guessing, and no matter what decision is made, it'll just be used as this kind of cannon fodder in this endless Schmittian political trench warfare, which is going back and forth. So I just wonder if countries could even deal with a crisis like this anymore in the same way, because you have to imagine that they just wouldn't be able to get anything done, because no matter what course of action they took, the other side would call it, would freak out about it. And depending on whether it was the left or right, they'd say it was fascism or whatever. And you just wouldn't be able to get anything done. So, I mean, how do you actually deal with a crisis in a nation which is now multicultural, so there is no shared cultural identity? It's now hyper politically partisan, so everyone hates each other. Would you even be able to deal with something like this? And I think the answer is probably no. I mean, you can even apply this to things like what's going on in Europe with Russia-Ukraine war, that there's all this squabbling over it, that it's kind of become this hot button topic, whether the country supports Ukraine or whether they want to pull aid. And everything is just so hyper politicized today that a country actually having some kind of coherent plan, they might not have the competence for that, but would they even have the capability, due to the fact that these aren't healthy, stable, coherent nations anymore, but these multicultural, liberal, post-national economic zones.
Yeah, I mean, what you get is the elites just going rogue and no longer caring about what the general population have to say, or getting them on board, or getting them to believe in it. They just kind of run roughshod over public opinion. They don't care. They don't seem to care whatsoever. And I agree. I think the Kennedys were in alignment, and it did actually seem to be, despite all of the technological advances and all of this, that he was more in tune with the people and more representative of the people. And he seemed even maybe to care about them, which is a rare thing, not just in America, but across the whole of the West. But what an interesting thing that we haven't touched on, which I noticed, is that it was a very Irish cabinet. I mean, you got both the Kennedys plus Donnelly plus McNamara, and I wonder. I find that an interesting thing there. I've got to drive through it. Give us a second, just. And you wonder if that is a kind of, if they too are outsiders and that they alienated other parts of the regime. They were seen as a danger because they weren't WASPs. Would you class the Kennedys as WASPs?
Well, no, they were Irish Catholics, so I think they would have been Ellis Islanders.
Yeah, so
I think Kennedy was has been the only Catholic president. Oh, well, Biden, I think, was Catholic, but before then, I think he was the only Catholic one.
Yeah, and I'm Democrats, and I just find that a funny thing, because where would they stand in relation to a Semitic elite? Let's put it that way. What was their views on those people who at this time would have been kind of coming up through and beginning to supplant the WASPs? But I don't know. It's not something that I've looked into, and there's only so many things you can look into and research. But generally speaking, the relationship between Catholics and Irish Catholics and Jewish people has not been they've been very aware of each other. Who was it? I think there was somebody was if like a big influencer is going to become a Catholic, it's seen as a problem in the Republican Party and all of this kind of thing. So who knows? But yeah, that is the administration as we saw it in the film was very Irish.
Yeah, that's one thing that does stand out from of John F. Kennedy, that He was somewhat of an outsider in that regard. So he was from Massachusetts, which was at that point in the mid 19th century became a very Irish Catholic state. Yeah, which makes him a bit of an outsider. But I mean, these days, I don't know if it matters so much. Like, I don't get the sense that Joe Biden being Catholic made him any less, like, pro-Semitic or anything like that. Even though, the other take is that in the United States, it was actually the Catholics were actually a lot more aligned with the Jews politically, that they were a lot more to the left than the WASP establishment. Now, unfortunately, what's happened is that the WASPs have just been totally co-opted by Zionism in the last couple of decades. But if you look in the early 20th century to mid 20th century, the Jews saw the WASP as their primary enemies, and kind of found somewhat of an ally in the Irish Catholics, and that they were somewhat of an outsider. I guess you could also add that to Italians into that as well. Like, they kind of saw Catholics somewhat as an ally. I wouldn't say that. I wouldn't say quite to that extent, but the extent of, like, say, the blacks who have they've gone to bat for kind of to use as a bludgeon against the white majority. But as an outsider, they were on board with a lot of the more liberal leftist movements of the 20th century that really undermined the WASP establishment, which existed in the U.S. In the early 20th century. Anyway, but that's kind of a bit beyond the scope of the stream. Do you have any more takes on 13 Days? Is there anything else you wanted to add?
There is one thing. It's a bit clumsy, but I recently went to see with the wife the Michael Jackson film. Now, obviously, Michael Jackson's life turned out to be quite controversial, and there's even conspiracies around that. But then you also had the Freddie Mercury one. And I was thinking that 13 Days, like, leaving aside all of the politics and stuff, if you have a look at that photo, like, on there now, like, we've all seen that photo, like this kind of Bobby and Jack Kennedy wandering around next to the, like, that. I've seen that photo without it being on this film. And I do think it's fascinating that this is like a kind of early version of that, because more recently, though, we've seen these films like the Michael Jackson and the Queen one, and I find it interesting the way they're kind of tapping into nostalgia. And the Michael Jackson one is like, you can recreate Michael Jackson. You can have him do the moonwalk. You can have him sing the songs again. And at least the film that I saw was like unbelievably sympathetic towards him, where he was kind of like this Peter Pan character. And there's going to be another one, I think. So it didn't get into the later stuff with the kids and whatnot, but it seems where the direction they're going in is that he didn't have a childhood, so he wants to be Peter Pan. But what it means is that for like the Zoomer generation, they can kind of have Michael Jackson again, and they can have Freddie Mercury again, and Queen songs again. As if it's all fresh and all new, and it's all just came out again. And there's a certain element about 13 Days of that as well, with how nice and colorful. You can think this is what it was like when we had a competent president, this legendary figure that was cut down in his prime, and it sort of touches a few buttons here or there on like away from just politics, but in a kind of cultural nostalgia, which there seems to be a bottomless need for. But again, this is like from 2000, but especially with these Queen Michael Jackson films, I see that.
Well, yeah, one thing you can see in that they did in the movie was that, like, the scene where Robert Kennedy and John F. Kennedy are outside talking on the outside the White House. They actually have a few seconds of those scenes in black and white, and it's really effective. And the reason they do that is because everybody who has seen the pictures of John F. Kennedy at the White House and him in the Oval Office or him outside with Robert, those pictures were in black and white. So the movie doing that is kind of a nod to people's memory of the early 1960s and of the era in which John F. Kennedy was the president. So the film does kind of play into that a little, if you noticed.
Yeah, and you like JFK is one of those presidents, a little bit like Trump, where he's very photogenic. Like photos always seem to make him look good, which is not so much the case with other world leaders at all. But yeah, great film.
Oh yeah, I really enjoyed this one. So it's definitely one worth watching. I mean, maybe a little bit boomer coded, but in terms of like a historical drama and one that's really tense, and honestly, one that is just fun to watch and kind of makes you yearn for a time that it just wasn't so politicized. I know it's a political drama, but one thing that I just found so refreshing about the movie is that you don't get the sense that JFK or McNamara or Robert Kennedy, you don't get the sense that they're libtards or anything like that. Even though they were Democrats, they would have been considered liberals at the time. I just like to get that you get the sense that they're statesmen who are in charge of their country. They're not these like hyper ideological people like fighting this kind of political trench warfare. They're just like representatives of their state, which is something you just don't get these days. So that to me was the thing that it made me yearn for the most. Anyway,
there's no tension with the Republicans. They're just not in this at all.
Right. Yeah. So it's just the Kennedy administration, but you don't get the sense that they're hyper ideological or hyper partisan, which I liked about the film. Do you know what you want to do for next month?
No, I haven't got a clue.
All right, that's fine. Well, we got a lot of time to decide that. So thanks to everyone for watching today, and we'll see you next time. It'll be on Morgoth's channel next month. So see you later.
See you later.